Central States Numismatic Society. This is our third seminar yet today, and this is featuring Wendell Wolka. Wendell's a personal friend of mine. We're both Hoosiers, and admit it, but he is a Purdue Hoosier. That's a different type of Hoosier.
Small H.
Small H.
Yes.
But Wendell is on the ANA board, and he's also on the Central States board, and he is very much an author and expert on all things paper. And Wendell, thank you for coming.
All right. Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Well, we're going to have some great fun today talking about the wild and woolly and wacky world of banking right outside of our door here in Cincinnati, Ohio. From the time the state was founded in 1803 right up to the middle of the Civil War. And lots of great stories, lots of interesting things. Some things never change. You talk about bank failures today, we got lots of them in Cincinnati. We even had bank riots in Cincinnati. People took to the streets because of the banks in 1842. So we're going to look at most of the main issuers in town from 1803 until 1863. There are over 167 other issuers of notes in town that issued little script notes and IOUs that we don't have time to talk about today, but hopefully you'll have a better appreciation for what it was like to deal with something as simple as money you were trying to spend in Cincinnati, Ohio. So off we go. We probably need to kill the light. Number 3 is the best?
Correct.
Okay. Operator error. There we go. All right. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about antebellum, namely pre-Civil War, Cincinnati banking for the first 6 decades of the 19th century. So just a quick history lesson. Of course, Cincinnati is a river town. This is a picture of the riverfront circa about 1865. It's literally right outside our door here. If you went 4 blocks that way, thereabouts, you would be someplace right around in here someplace. As you can see, Cincinnati was a very important river town on the Ohio River. Lots of steamboats, lots of commission warehouses and so forth right along the bank of the river. So just a real quick history lesson. Cincinnati was founded in 1788. The name was changed from, I'll probably butcher this, I believe it's Lasanteville. It'd be heck to cheer on the Lasanteville Reds. It somehow just doesn't feel good. So they changed the name for that and several other reasons to Cincinnati. And they picked the name Cincinnati because territorial governor Arthur St. Clair belonged to the Society of Cincinnati, and Cincinnatus, who was the great farmer, military person, politician of ancient Rome, was the genesis for the name of Cincinnati. So they changed the name in 1790. Now this is still 13 years before Ohio even became a state, so we're talking about the territory rather than the state. Cincinnati had a population of a whopping 1,000 souls in 1803 at the time of statehood. By 1820, it had grown tenfold. And Cincinnati was home to a number of fledgling industries, including meat packing. One of Cincinnati's less flattering names is Porkopolis, which made us in Indianapolis feel pretty good about what they named our city. And obviously transportation, riverboats, canals, and banking. And it took advantage of the city's strategic proximity to the Ohio River, which was obviously at that point in time a major transportation artery. So we're going to break this up into the early banks, pre-1830, and the later banks. And we've got a whole big group of these. There wasn't hardly a street corner in Cincinnati that at one time or another didn't have a bank on it, someplace. Some of these banks are located within a block of the building we sit in as we speak. So I did these alphabetically, so you're going to see the dates jump around a little bit, but we're going to talk about these, the Bank of Cincinnati, the Bank of John H. Pyatt and Company, the Bank of the United States had a branch here, the Commercial Bank of Cincinnati, Farmers and Mechanics Bank of Cincinnati, the Miami Exporting Company, the Ohio Exporting and Importing Company. So we're going to take a look at each one of these. The Bank of Cincinnati, this is Cincinnatus. This is who the town was named after, and the reason we know it's him is because we didn't have many Ohio farmers in 1803 wearing a toga while they plowed. So this is a portrait of Cincinnatus. If you look at the medal for this convention, you'll see that there's a startling likeness between this vignette and the portrait here on the note. This is a $3 note that was issued. For those of you not familiar with paper money previous to the Civil War, $3 was a very common denomination. Not unusual at all, and not the most unusual denomination you'll even see from Cincinnati. At any rate, this is the typical operating pattern you see in the early banks in Cincinnati. It opened in 1814. It opened without the benefit of getting a charter from the state. It just did it because it could. The state soon got all exercised about that, and you find that it finally took a charter in 1816, 2 years later. And then the predictable happened. It failed in 1819. It reopened in 1820. It failed again in 1821. Not to be outdone, it reopened in 1837, and it finally closed for good in 1842. The reason for its closing is rather interesting. It's called the Cincinnati Bank Riot of January the 11th, 1842. The fine citizens of Cincinnati finally had the 19th century equivalent of a tea party in downtown Cincinnati, and they said, we finally had it. The Bank of Cincinnati failed, and this prompted the folks with the pitchforks and the torches to run amok down the street where most of the banks were located, and they quite systematically looted every bank on the street. Took the notes out of the safe, threw them on the street, took the furniture, threw it out the windows, and the Bank of Cincinnati thus failed in January the 11th, 1842. Sometimes these dates aren't quite so fluid, but this is very clear from local newspapers. They were all reporting about the rabble in Cincinnati who took to the streets on January the 11th. Now, you may ask, well, how could it close and open and close and open and close and open so many times? The Ohio State Legislature, being a group of very slow learners, like most legislatures are even to this day, never got around to canceling the charters when the banks failed. So they just sat there. Somebody came along with enough money to have some notes printed, and you could have notes printed in this time period for about a penny a piece. So if you were a capitalist with a couple $100 in silver or gold coin, you could start the bank up again. And that's what they did. Now, the reason we had all these failures, and you'll see this again, 1821 happened to be the depth of the post-War of 1812 recession. And so if you were a bank that was very poorly capitalized, a la Bank of America or Citicorp, and you got into a depression, e.g. what we're putting up with now, you failed. Except back then, you were allowed to fail. And 1837, 1842, these banks quite often opened years later. So this thing lay dormant for 16 years before somebody opened it up again. The later notes on the Bank of Cincinnati are interesting that they proudly proclaim that they were chartered in 1816. Well, the fact is the bank had only opened again in 1837. So there was always a little puffery involved with banking back then. The Bank of John H. Piatt and Company. This is my favorite note because it actually is a coin note. It shows two coins, nominally dollar coins. You can see the John H. Piatt and Company is proudly scrawled across this. This is circa 1818. Opened in 1817, surprise, surprise, without a charter. And you ask, how could they do that? It's because they could. There was very minimal direction from, at that time, Chillicothe or Columbus, wherever the state capital happened to be at any given point in time. And so you just did it because you could. Oh, try and press the right one. There we go. Failed in 1820, the tail end of the recession that happened after the War of 1812. Notes were traded at about a 75% discount in 1820, and we know this from newspaper articles and so forth that have survived down to this date. When you got to the point you were at a 75% discount, it said in essence you were out of business. You were Citicorp selling at $1.72. And Piatt's practice of redeeming his notes only in the notes of other banks was a major reason for the bank's collapse. In theory, even at this early date, you had some expectation that if I gave you a note across your counter, you would give me back gold and silver, gold or silver. Almost never happened. A lot of banks said, fine, we'll take in our worthless trash and we'll give you some of their worthless trash in exchange. And then you saw if you could find somebody to take the other guy's worthless trash. So the fact that John was not really very scrupulous in terms of redeeming his notes in specie led essentially to his demise. The Bank of the United States, this is the second Bank of the United States. There was, cleverly enough, a first Bank of the United States. This was the second bank. I don't have a note on the bank, so I had to substitute a check. Checks in this time period were not that common. Most people did not have personal checking accounts. There were business accounts to settle balances due and so forth, but not very many personal checking accounts. So this is an example of a check from the bank. It was open from 1817 to 1820. You're going, wait a minute, the date says 1833. Why is that? Well, because just like everything else, after the Chillicothe branch, a few miles up the road here, closed in 1825, they reopened the branch for 10 years from 1825 to 1835 in Cincinnati. The bank's lending practices made it unpopular. This was their lending practice. If you owe us money, we expect you to pay it back. This was unheard of in Western banking. The idea was you never paid a loan back, you just rolled it over for another term. And so their lending practices tended to get things into this death spiral of they wanted their money back from the banks. The banks go, oh my, we have to call in loans from people who have bought land, real estate, on credit and overextended themselves. They can't pay their bills. The price of land goes down the dumper, and guess what? Some things never change. The Commercial Bank of Cincinnati, you knew we had to have one that worked sooner or later. This is an uncut sheet of 20 and a 50. This is Christopher Columbus on the right there and George Washington on the left. Scene from the Revolutionary War. Washington on the heights with the cannons and the whole 9 yards. It was chartered in 1829. They couldn't scrounge up enough money to open the bank until 1831. And this again was not unusual. There were banks that took 10 years to scrape together enough real money to actually open. So this is quite typical of the time period. Its charter expired in 1843, and it became a new state-chartered independent bank in 1845.
Independent of what?
Oh, that's what they called the bank. They called the bank the independent banks because the enabling legislation in 1845 set up two parallel banking systems in the state. The State Bank of Ohio, with 41 branches, and the so-called independent banks, which were standalone one-location banks around the state. So it was just what they called them at the time. There's another group of banks we'll talk about a little later that they called the state stock banks or the free banks, which came into existence a little later. So the independent bank was just their moniker for these standalone banks that were based on, there's no security was based on state stocks that were deposited, actually bonds. But this is a bank that actually made it past the Civil War. In 1865, it became the Commercial National Bank of Cincinnati. And for you national banknote collectors, that's its charter number 1185. So it was the tail end of the first big surge of national bank organizations during the war. And this bank, usually the hallmark of a successful bank was there wasn't much in outstanding circulation. In 1875, according to the state records, this bank had less than $1,600 outstanding, which is a minuscule amount to the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they put in circulation. The Farmers and Mechanics Bank of Cincinnati, again, a very early institution, opened in 1812, finally got around to getting a charter in 1813 and becoming an honest person. Failed in 1819, and here we go again. Reopened in 1820, failed again in 1821. The Miami Exporting Company is of some fame. This is an earlier note from the organization. It was essentially Ohio's first bank. It was chartered less than 6 weeks after Ohio became a state. And it was originally envisioned as a agricultural products exporting company, taking advantage of the fact that you had the Ohio River that would take you all the way to New Orleans. Its original intended purpose in the charter was to export agricultural products. That lasted for about 4 years, and by 1807, the only thing it was exporting from the state was banknotes. It ceased active operation in 1822, went dormant until 1834, reopened in 1834, and failed during the dreaded January 11th bank riot of 1842. This bank found its notes thrown out on the street. One of the local newspapers of the time said that they found over $300,000 worth of notes in the bank vault and about $200 in silver and gold. So this is what we call today leverage. What we called it back then was they didn't have enough specie reserves to even come remotely close to redeeming any of their circulation.
Is there a chance that any of these notes that are on the bank that are being collected now were ones that were thrown out of the bank at that time?
It's possible. They probably would have been unissued remainders. A remainder is simply a note that wasn't filled out. It was still in sheet form in the vault or whatever. It's possible. Most collectors prefer to have an issued note. And these are relatively inexpensive. There's a bunch of different varieties of the bank. This is not an expensive note to own.
You take a remainder and a quill pen and you get an issued note.
Well, you could. You could. Then we have the lookalikes, or I've heard that name someplace banks. And thus we have the Ohio Exporting and Importing Company. This is an exceedingly rare note. It is the only note I'm aware of on the bank. It's issued in 1816. And it was opened circa 1814 to the 1830s. We don't know a whole lot about this bank other than it was listed in several contemporary counterfeit detectors as a fraudulent institution. Now, what is a counterfeit detector? Counterfeit detector is like the Wall Street Journal of the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And this newspaper tabloid type publication listed all the good banks, all the bad banks, all the counterfeits that they knew about, and of course they like that. You can take, Joel, maybe let's take a look at that after we get done. Several problems. A, that information was usually outdated, and the counterfeiters could move faster than people could find out about them. Number two, very difficult to have a very complete description of what a counterfeit looked like. A lot of times it'd have a description like dark and coarse. Dark and, whatever dark and coarse means. The other thing is these folks who printed these counterfeit detectors could be bribed. And you, as a bank who was in trouble, would simply go down to your local counterfeit detector publisher. You would suggest that an honorarium might be in the offing or advertising if he could possibly just not necessarily bring up the fact that you were in trouble just right now. And so you necessarily couldn't trust what you were reading. So the biggest fault, of course, is that the counterfeiters could read too. And so if you said in your counterfeit detector that counterfeits have a big red berry on the end of Victory's nose, they would take the little red berry off of the end of Victory's nose on their next batch of counterfeits that they put out. And this is a case where the name was possibly intended to be intentionally confused with the Miami Exporting Company, because for a time the Miami Exporting Company was a fairly successful venture. So some of that's speculation on my part, but we're good at speculating. So those are some of the early banks. You'll see there, I think there was one that actually made it past 1840. So then we have this transition period from 1831 and beyond. By 1831, the state had figured out that we needed more money in circulation to help fund things. And so by 1831, they started chartering more banks to keep up with the demand for capital. The Bank of the United States was not willing to provide sufficient capital and closed in 1836. This, of course, was Jackson's vendetta with the Bank of the United States. And again, they had this silly little rule about expecting you to pay loans back that was simply getting in people's way. So the bank closed in 1836, leaving a vacuum for other banks. 1845 brought really the first organization to the state's banking system. Up to 1845, every bank was an individual handcrafted charter that somebody walked through the state legislatures. There was no template for what a charter included. One of the problems in the early ones is there was a bank in Mansfield, Ohio, which is way up north in the state here, whose lobbyist actually ended up voting against his own bill somehow, and they failed to get a charter. So the hired help was of sometimes rather checkered quality. But as we mentioned in answer to Joe's question, in 1845 they had the State Bank of Ohio. It had 41 branches across the state, extremely successful. State Bank of Ohio was one of the largest banks in the United States prior to the Civil War. The independent banks, 1851, brought the legislation authorizing the final state chartered banks to issue the so-called state stock banks or free banks. And then in 1863, this grand and glorious chaos was brought to a conclusion with the advent of the national banking system. So for a period of about 2 years, from 1863 to 1865, we had this major transition. And we'll touch on that in a little bit. So some of the later banks, Bank of the Ohio Valley in 1858, Banking House of John S. Dye, 1846, Cincinnati Banking and Loan Office, 1841, the Citizens Consolidated Banking Company, the City Bank of Cincinnati, the Exchange Bank of Cincinnati, Franklin Bank of Cincinnati, If you just got paid every time you printed Cincinnati, you'd do well here. The Lafayette Bank of Cincinnati, Mechanics and Traders Bank, those were some of the later banks. So the Bank of the Ohio Valley was a much later reincarnation. It was opened as a free bank, and you'll see right here it says Free Bank of Ohio, but they also called them state stock banks. And why they flip-flop back and forth between the two titles, don't know, but they did. It was kind of a banker's bank, and it acted primarily as a clearinghouse for the branches of the State Bank of Ohio and other client banks. It issued some currency, but not very much. It was purchased by the Third National Bank of Cincinnati in 1871. The Third National Bank, of course, is one of the ancestors of today's Fifth Third Bank. And it had less than $600 in outstanding circulation in 1871. I have not personally seen an actual issued note on the bank. They're all these so-called proofs. Proofs were notes that were issued when the engraving company was ready to go, and they showed you as the customer, this is what they're going to look like. Let's all shake our heads up and down so we can harden the steel on the plates and get going. So this is a proof. These black splotches they used to punch holes in the signature line, so somebody didn't get the bright idea of making some signatures up and putting these in circulation. So that's what those are for. This is an interesting story. This is the banking house of John S. Dye. But you always had to be able to read the fine print if you were accepting paper money in the 1840s, 1850s, because this is not an issue of the banking house of John S. Dye. This is payable at the banking house of John S. Dye. The City Exchange Company of Memphis, Tennessee is the actual issuer. But it was redeemable in Cincinnati. So, you know, we'll gladly pay you, we just will pay you 600 miles away. Very common occurrence. John S. Dye is kind of interesting because, so this was open roughly late 1840s, mid-1850s to the mid-1850s. And it served as a payment location for this City Exchange Company of Memphis. And John S. Dye, unless this is just an incredible coincidence, also happened to be the proprietor of Dye's Bank Mirror and Illustrated Counterfeit Detector. So now we have someone who's taking notes in and paying notes out, telling you which ones are good and which ones are bad. This is probably a conflict of interest by today's standards. The Cincinnati Banking and Loan Office. This is a testament to survival. You'll look at this note and go, my, that is one ugly note. But until about 3 weeks ago, this note was encased in Scotch tape that had gone yellow and transparent. And after a trip to the Center for Artistic and Historic Document Restoration in Philadelphia, it at least has come out of that mess. But we had often thought that this was just a mistake in the records. As it turns out, it was open circa 1840, 1841 for a short period of time. We know it failed in 1841 because it's listed in another counterfeit detector, Van Court's counterfeit detector, as a no sale in 1841. When you went from 75% discount to no sale, you have hit bottom. It means it isn't worth anything to anybody. And we never had seen a note from this bank. We even suggested the bank may not have even existed until last year. So things keep bubbling to the surface all the time, and what you think is done research often is not done. Citizens Consolidated Banking Company. This is the only one I don't own a note on, but it was open circa 1841, undoubtedly a fraudulent institution. And this is interesting because it technically is a New York note. Now, I've seen a note in its dateline New York, New York, but it's payable in Cincinnati. So people from New York collect a note. These are called tie notes, T-I-E. And people from New York collect a note. We collect them from Ohio. It's payable in Ohio, but it was realistically, probably more correctly, listed as a New York bank. Bank of Cincinnati. This is one of the independent banks. All the independent banks had very similar note designs. They had most of the vignettes were the same and so forth. But it opened in 1845, liquidated in 1857. What happened in 1857? The Panic of 1857. Not because of the SS Central America, but because the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company collapsed. The Central America may have had something to do with it, but certainly wasn't the precipitating event of the Panic of 1857. Here's another one that you go, aha, this is issued by the Exchange Bank of Cincinnati. Not. It's issued by it's issued actually in Nashville, Tennessee. Opened from about 8 years, which means they kept it going. But the bank served as the paying agent for a number of different banks in Ohio and other states, notably Tennessee. And until I got this note, I never realized that all the counterfeit detectors that listed the quote-unquote checks of Otis Arnold and Company as a fraudulent issuer. Otis Arnold and Company signed this note. So these are the checks, in fact, that they were talking about. Franklin Bank of Cincinnati. Sometimes we have sad things happen to note. This one had the right end ripped off. But since we collect paper money, we don't worry about it too much. It got back together again, so no harm, no foul. It was open for a 10-year period until 1843. It converted into a branch of the State Bank of Ohio and became the Franklin branch of Cincinnati. And in 1852, it withdrew as a branch, continued as a private bank until 1906, and ultimately became a part of the Citizens National Bank of Cincinnati. Lafayette Bank, some of these notes are very beautiful. This is the back of the note. This is the face. You see, you have the presidents, the early presidents of the United States, a portrait of the namesake of the bank, Lafayette, and I'm not sure who the person on the right is. But the Lafayette Bank was another long-lived bank. It had a 20-year history as just a regular one-location state-chartered bank. 1854, it became the Lafayette Banking Company. 1862 to 1863, it converted back to a free bank, or if you would, a state stock bank, but it didn't issue circulation. And then finally, it later merged with the National Bank of Commerce of Cincinnati in the late 1870s. Mechanics and Traders Bank of Cincinnati. This was another bank involved in the bank riot of January the 11th. It opened in 1838 at the corner of Main and East 3rd, which, how far is that from here, would you guess? A couple blocks? Now, the problem is, I found out they changed the numbering system on the streets sometime between then and now, so you can't necessarily depend on today's street numbering. But at any rate, it opened in 1838. It was targeted during the bank riot of 1842, but actually had enough money to survive. Voluntarily wound up its business in 1844.
What was under his order?
Or his order. Under banknotes, payable in current banknotes.
No, I mean, his order was laid on over something in the inquiry.
Oh, bearer.
On return of this certificate.
Yeah, technically this probably would be construed as a certificate of deposit, but all these notes are horrifically well circulated, so they didn't just sit in somebody's desk drawer until it came time to return them. At any rate, it became the Mechanics and Traders branch of the State Bank of Ohio in 1845. It's suspended on November 20th, 1854, and was one of the very few branches that was placed in receivership by the State Bank of Ohio. Now, 1854, we had a mini recession. We had a mini recession related to the, oh, Joe, help me out. The war over the charge of the Light Brigade, the Crimean War. After the Crimean War had reached this point, they had a collapse in commodity prices. And banks that had exposure to commodities down the dumper. Indiana lost most of its banks in 1854, rather than one of the other panics, for example. So this bank went under November 20th, 1854. There were some later banks, the New England Bank, 1850-51, the Ohio and Cincinnati Loan Office, the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, Savings Bank of Cincinnati, the State Bank of Ohio Franklin branch. The State Bank of Ohio had 2 locations in town. State Bank of Ohio Mechanics and Traders branch, the Union Bank of Exchange, and last but not least, the Western Banking Company. So the New England Bank has been a mystery. Until we found this note, we were again convinced that this was some earlier cataloger's whiff, because it was unusual to have something called the New England Bank headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. And yet when the note popped up, sure enough, it's dateline Cincinnati, Ohio. So someone else has just recently told me that there is a reference to it in one of the 1851 city directories as being in business. So in fact, at least for a very short period of time, it was in fact in business. So this is slightly out of date by about a week. There is, interestingly enough, Stax sooner or later will be auctioning off the original printing plate for this. And so we know that there was there were 4 different denominations, a 10, a 20, and 2 10s, a 20, and a 50. The Ohio and Cincinnati Loan Office, as I say, $3 bills weren't rare. $1.25 notes weren't even rare. They're somewhat rarer, but you could come up with, well, why would they have that? Well, $1.25, 2.5, 5. It was a legitimate fraction. Unauthorized note issuer, which reportedly failed in 1841. In addition to $1.25 notes, they also issued $1.50 and $4 notes, not to be outdone. The Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, very rare to find a note from this bank. I don't own this note. This got lifted from an eBay auction listing. Opened in 1834 with a state charter. And because these are all kind of handcrafted things, its authority to issue circulation ended in 1843. But it continued on doing business and selling insurance, annuities, and so forth. And it failed in 1857. They had an office in Cincinnati, and they had an office in New York. The office in New York was playing footloose and fancy-free with loan policies. Where have we heard this before? And lo and behold, the day of reckoning came and they failed. But for a very fortunate business trip, the State Bank of Ohio may have completely failed in 1857 as well. 2 directors from the bank were in New York City and put $200,000 in cash in 2 carpet bags, and off they went. So the Savings Bank of Cincinnati, these are great notes. Wonderful vignette, goes from all the way completely across the note. Opened in 1851 as a so-called free bank. Placed on this. These folks tended to be in trouble a lot, though. They were placed on the state bank examiner watch list in 1854. And on December 1860, they refused to redeem one $10 note that was presented by someone representing the Bank of the Ohio Valley. Their refusal to redeem that one $10 note resulted in them being shut down. And so the bank's securities were sold in early 1861 and the circulation was redeemed at par. Now the way this worked is you as the banker bought up a bunch of state bonds and you deposited those with, in this case, the auditor of the state, and you drew interest on those bonds and you got to issue circulation equal to the amount of the bonds. So you double dipped. You earned money on the bank notes that you put into circulation as loans, and you got interest on your bonds. We know that it's a 20 by the, you can read it, if you could magnify it enough, you'd see it's the word 20 repeated over and over again. So this was a spurious bank circa, again, the 1839-1840. It appears in various counterfeit detectors as a fraud starting in 1840, which means it was probably closer to 1839. And again, the possibility exists this is a total fabrication. Other than banks, there were a couple other issuers, the Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal Company, the Corporation of Cincinnati, the City of Cincinnati, if you would, and of all things, the Detroit and St. Joseph Railroad Bank, payable at Ford Brothers, 1838. Plus over 116 other issuers of scrip, due bills, advertising notes, college currency, and the like, every one of which we're going to go through in detail here. But no, that's a lie. That's a lie. Nobody head for the door. Be nice. The Cincinnati Whitewater Canal Company is kind of interesting. Canal building was a very popular thing to do in the Midwest in the 1820s, 1830s. This was a rather humble affair. It was chartered by the state of Ohio in 1837 to build a 25-mile long canal that connected the Whitewater Canal in southeastern Indiana, just over the border here, with downtown Cincinnati and the Ohio River. It was built 1839 to 1843, and essentially, as happened with many of these canals, the railroads essentially put them out of business almost before they were even finished. In fact, many of the railroads bought the canal towpaths to lay right-of-way for the tracks. Corporation of Cincinnati, I'm not sure these were ever existed, but these are essentially corporate issues, or they are municipal issues of the city of Cincinnati. They appear to date, from the looks of things, probably about the 1820s, maybe even a little earlier than that. Have never seen a circulated note, so don't know if they ever issued them or not. The Detroit and St. Joseph Railroad Bank at Ford Brothers, you see all sorts of notes that are stamped, courageously assuring you that they're payable at our banking house, Cincinnati, Ohio, signed by Ford Brothers and Company. Railroad was chartered by the state of Michigan in 1835. Some notes were payable at Ford Brothers in Cincinnati, primarily as a means of slowing down redemptions. We'll very happily redeem this. We'll very happily redeem this 200 miles away. The Michigan Bank itself failed in 1840, so there's a relative, you can see this is dated 1840, so this is right at probably the point of collapse. And then there was a flood of other papers circulating. College notes. College notes were issued for use in the classroom. And people who were trained to be clerks, bookkeepers, accountants actually learn by doing, if you would. So you saw these things. The most interesting one I've seen is they usually say that these are only for use in the classroom. One Columbus, Ohio college bank simply put on the back, stolen from the Acme Business College, which I thought was a rather pushy approach. But then you had little advertising notes. So those of you who collect fractional currency will look at that almost twice and say, oh, that looks familiar. Well, what it actually is, it's a 50-cent coupon for having your teeth extracted at the rate of 25 cents for each tooth. at 160 West 5th. So if you'd like to join me, we'll go 5 blocks down the street here, and we'll see if they're still in business. Hotels. The Burnett House was a popular Civil War hotel in the city during and prior to the Civil War. The Bank of the Ohio Valley actually served as a payment agency for a hatter. C.H. Camp and Company, who were hatters. They made millinery products at 95 West 3rd Street, so a couple blocks that way. And all these notes were put in circulation because during the Civil War, Gresham's Law took hold. Everybody know what Gresham's Law is? Bad money drives out good. So all coin disappeared. So you had these little teeny tiny IOUs, you had Civil War tokens, you had all sorts of things that were stamps floating around trying just to make change to keep business going. Perry's Bank of Cincinnati, $50. No, it's $50 worth of ladies and gents furnishing and fancy goods if you give us $50 in current money. So this is called an advertising note. This is a rarer, earlier issue. It sort of kind of almost looks like it could be a note circa 1855, but if you read the fine print, it really isn't. The idea was to get you to stop long enough to read the ad. The Gibson House, Cincinnati. This is a fairly common advertising note. Again, the back of this note extols the virtues of the newly refurbished Gibson House in Cincinnati.
On the face of the note, emulates the $5
Yep.
vendor.
Yep. This was as close as you tiptoed up to pushing somebody to think you were counterfeiting. So they, some of the more aggressive ones actually kept it as a 5. These folks cribbed it just a little bit and made it a 3. Never issued a 3 federal note. The Great Western #1 Clothing Emporium, a $51 bill if you would. They assured you it was absolutely no trouble to show goods.
It's cheap and fashionable.
Cheap and fashionable, there you go. So these are kind of fun notes. Again, these are very early. You see it has a vignette of the, if we looked at the very first part of the program, there's a view of the riverfront in downtown Cincinnati. The exposition script, this was, Cincinnati was home of the Industrial Exposition in the early 1880s, and you had companies who issued these notes that they'd redeem if you bought so many dollars in goods from them at the exposition. And finally, my favorite, E.B. Taylor Wig Maker, 13 and 15 East 4th Street. So 1 block down, a little bit that way. So this, again, this person went to a fair amount of expense to have this printed. It is comparable in quality to regular banknotes that were printed. It has a custom, or what would appear to be a custom vignette of his place of business. And so kind of an interesting note. So you never know what you find in Cincinnati.
Are those stock portraits?
This is and that is, yes. I don't know if this is or not, Joe. It could easily be just a stock portrait of a commercial block, but I think it has his name on the lintel above the door. I'm not sure. So that's another story for another day, though. So thank you very much for your attention. Have a great day. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yes, sir.
How typical was it? I mean, even some of the later notes, I noticed that at least these Cincinnati institutions, it wasn't common for, I don't see a heavy use of protectors or color on most of the notes.
No. The only people that really did, and it was an issue of cost. It was an issue of cost. That's why many obsolete notes don't even have any back design, because you could have a note printed for about 1.25 cents a piece. And if you printed it on both sides, you doubled that. If you added color, then you tripled that because it necessitated another plate.
Were a lot of those American banknote company or?
Not many of them, no, no. So they used some color. The state stock banks or the free banks went to color, starting about 1856, but a lot of them didn't.
Are these also referred to as the broken banknotes?
Yeah, yeah. Some people have called them broken banknotes, the idea being that the bank went broke. And so traditionally they've been called broken banknotes too.
How about the term wildcat?
Wildcat, Cincinnati had its share. These are banks whose only existence was in the imagination of their founders.
Wasn't there supposedly I understand there was a note from a bank in Michigan, a spurious issue in Michigan that actually had a
Yeah.
cougar or something on it.
Well, there's one from Indiana that has a rather nasty looking striped feline on it of unknown origin. But yeah, the idea with banks back then, of course, was not to have the largest building in town that you could see from 5 miles away. The idea was to get your building as far away from human civilization as possible. The best example is not here in Cincinnati, because Cincinnati was a pretty big town, but in northern Indiana, the Salem Bank and Trust Company, which still exists today, I might add, had their office in Wakarusa, Indiana. Wakarusa is the native Indian dialect for knee-deep mud. And so this suggests how convenient they made it for you to present notes for payment. So the idea was to hopefully not let anybody find you if you had a shot at it. Anything else?
Thank you, Wendell.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day.